Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. This is the final installment of our New York State History Month Talk Series 2021 from Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. I want to thank you very much for tuning into this program, both live via WebEx as well as perhaps later on in some other format as well. Mary Alexander is the Curator of Education and Public Engagement at the Arkell Museum and Canajoharie Library. She is passionate about history and art and making museums welcoming spaces for young and new visitors. It brings me great pleasure to introduce Mary, and thank you very much for joining us. Mary, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, David and Schoharie Crossing, for allowing me to give this presentation. This will be the second time that I've done this one, and I'm really excited about it. So welcome, and thank you for tuning in. The title of this is Memory and Celebration, examining the 1929 sesquicentennial of the Sullivan Clinton Campaign. So we're going to get going. We've got a couple of facets here. We're going to be talking about the historic event in 1779 and then the celebration in 1929 and our legacy of the both events, the legacy that we have today. So let's get going because we got a lot of ground to cover. To start with, a lot of folks from my last presentation kind of wondered, what is an art museum doing talking about history, and difficult history at that? How dare us? So this really started with a challenge from MANI, the Museum Association of New York, and IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We became part of their building capacity grant. They gave us some technology and a lot of direction, and they gave us direction and ideas and said, come up with a challenging story. What can your archives, your collections tell that's difficult to talk about? And we really found the Clinton Sullivan campaign and its sesquicentennial to be ripe for difficult conversations and conversations that need to be happening. So some ground rules. David has already pointed out some few things, but a couple of things to just note about the presentation. The presentation contains images that are racist in nature and are offensive. The Arkell Museum and Canajoharie Library does not support these racist images. They are shown as learning materials to encourage thoughtful, meaningful, and peaceful discussion. At no time will racial slurs, derogatory language, or violence be tolerated verbally or within the chat. David's going to definitely not allow that. We understand that these topics discussed within this presentation are difficult and possibly divisive. I also consider in this presentation that the Sullivan Clinton Campaign is an act of genocide defined by Article 2 of the Convention of the Preservation and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, according to the Geneva Convention of 1948. So land recognition statement, and this one's kind of a difficult one for me because Canajoharie Library and the Arkell Museum are on the ancestral homeland of the Mohawk people, or the Haudenosaunee, and I am coming to you from Schenectady and have not done my good research. I believe this is also Haudenosaunee land. Although we haven't connected with the tribes yet about coming up with a good land recognition statement, the museum feels it's only right to recognize that this presentation is being held on the ancestral land of the Mohawk people. And we give thanks for this opportunity to meet on this land and discuss these difficult and timely topics. So let's get started on the history. We are taking it back to the 1770s in central and western New York. I know none of you were there, but many of you probably have a lot of knowledge about this. The 1770s in central and western New York is really a landscape in steady conflict. It is a place where cultures are meeting, and oftentimes violently so. We have settler colonists coming in from from Eastern New York, from the Albany area, or pushing through the Catskills from Massachusetts. And we have the Haudenosaunee, or the Six Nations, who are living and have lived in the territory for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And they are meeting against one another. And when these cultures come together, they clash in very violent ways. It's definitely down to misunderstandings of cultural ways of doing things. It's also a clash of ground. People want this territory that the native people have and are often pushing their way in and illegally settling despite treaties and land agreements between the Haudenosaunee and the British. So this is a land of conflict. It had been in conflict for decades before this, and we head into 1775, 1776, and the declaration of war in what will become the American Revolution. And as we head into this time period, we really see border issues, border conflict between the Haudenosaunee and colonial settlers really ramp up. And with this, with the declaration of war, the Haudenosaunee Six Nations claim their neutrality. They don't want anything to do with this. They claim that it is a conflict between brothers and they are wanting to stay out of it. This is something that both the colonists, or Americans as they wish and will become, and the British don't like. They both want the Haudenosaunee on their side. They want access to Haudenosaunee territories to be able to move troops through, and they want access to the lands of the Haudenosaunee. The Haudenosaunee themselves are 6 different nations. However, they come together in a confederacy that is very powerful. They have a strong I don't know if army is the right word, but they have a warrior class that is quite strong. They are a formidable people, and they are also know the land, they know the area, and so they are also important to just in managing a war that will be part of on this landscape. This is Edward Bike's painting that was commissioned actually in 1929, debuted in 1930. Since it was about to debut right as the stock market crashed, no one thought it was a good idea to debut a painting at that time. But this is Canajoharie. We are looking from a top where I would say the McDonald's is, maybe a little bit east or west, east of that. But we're looking into the Canajoharie Valley. We have probably Ruth's Tavern is that pillared picture, a little building in the center. We've got possibly native people dwelling up on the hill. We do know that Mohawk people lived in Canajoharie, right along Canajoharie Creek, and that is also, Canajoharie is a Mohawk word. So people are living in the region. There is conflict, and there's also really great things happening between this culture. There's a lot of exchange of goods, exchange of ideas. We get a lot of our democracy ideas from governing structures found within the Six Nations. But there's also a lot of terrible conflict. Good old George Washington, that is a painting in our collection by Gilbert Stuart. Really what we're going to be talking about here is the 1779 Indian Campaign, as it was called by George Washington. And George Washington in 1778 is noticing that there's been division within the Six Nations. Some of the nations are siding with the British, some have sided with the colonists. But George Washington decides to make a move on central and western New York. He wants to put down what he calls the threat of the Six Nations, and he does so with vehemence. He brings to bear 4,000 troops, and they, for different groups of troops, which is a funny way of saying that, kind of descend upon the region. This is also includes Pennsylvania, northern Pennsylvania as well, was Haudenosaunee territory at the time. And Washington is really looking to rout the Haudenosaunee out of their homes. He wants excuse me, one second. Uh, he wants to push the Haudenosaunee out of their villages and towns. He wants this because he sees them as a formidable threatening force and one that can easily support the British, which he definitely does not want to have happen. So to stop this, what he does is he orders his general, this is a quote to General John Sullivan from May 1779. And George Washington's orders are the immediate objects are the total destruction and devastation of their, being the Haudenosaunee, settlements and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex possible. It will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent them planting more. So this is a scorched earth campaign, and Washington is flat out saying it. He needs their crops destroyed. Maybe there's a threat that um, the British can use these crops within the next year. There's also the threat of continually feeding the Haudenosaunee people, and both of those things are not working well with the plans of the revolution, which is not going super well at the time either. So this is quite an outputting of force by Washington. It's quite an outputting of money as well. So a lot was riding on the Indian campaign. And as it went, it was pretty successful in a couple of regards and absolutely unsuccessful in others. They successfully burned their way through Haudenosaunee territory. There is acknowledged by Sullivan 40 settlements that were destroyed. These settlements had buildings, just to kind of orient you to the type of buildings, we have journals from the army of the colonists, and they're talking about these rich orchards, these rich fields that are growing well. They're talking about houses, long houses that have glass windows. These are well prepared villages. And I think it was surprising, the journals, the men seemed surprised to find this because they had been given this narrative of the savage that hasn't done anything with the land, and forcing out people is okay because they haven't done anything with the land. And this campaign really shows these soldiers that that is patently false. The native people of the region had been managing the ecology and had a vibrant economy for hundreds of years in the area. So Clinton rips through with his troops, burning as he goes. Most of Haudenosaunee war tactics included running away, having women and children run for it when they know a force is coming, which is understandable. And that was a way to save lives. One of the interesting things about the accounts from the time are that they're really accounts of how much was destroyed rather than the loss of life. It's either that Sullivan cared more for the physical destruction of things than the actual people that they were seen as less than. It also could be that it was hard to know how many people died. It is believed their population by the end of it, that the Haudenosaunee Six Nation population was halved by this event and the subsequent 1779 winter, which was considered one of the worst on record still today. I can't imagine anything more horrible than being routed from your home right before winter sets in upstate New York in 1779. So this is an interesting painting by Edward Bike. It is another one that was commissioned by Bartlett Arkell in 1929. It shows the event that our celebration we're going to be talking about is really all about, and that is the March of Clinton overland from Canajoharie over the hills into Otsego Lake near Cooperstown, down the lake into Cooperstown, where he builds a dam to basically be able to flood the Susquehanna River. They roll down the river and meet up with Sullivan's army to continue their scorched earth campaign. The native people, the Mohawk living in the valley in Canajoharie at the time, were sided with the Americans. So their villages in Canajoharie were not burned. That does not mean that they didn't receive worse things happening to them later in the war. This painting shows kind of the energy and activity that must have happened at the time. Just imagine having to move 2,000 men, 300 wagons, and 200 bateaux over land. Driving to and from Cooperstown is not terribly hard. I wouldn't want to do it in the winter. But even today, it's kind of a haul. It'll take you about 45 minutes. So I can't imagine having to do it overland on, there weren't roads. So on tracks, on, through the wild, basically, would not have been an easy thing to do. Some pictures here of beautiful Lake Otsego, where Clinton led his troops. We have right here, this is the little cannon marker that's in the river, purportedly where Clinton built his dam. There's lots of plaques and little things around here in the Cooperstown area, right at the headwaters of the Susquehanna. If you haven't taken a look at them, a lot of them relate to the topic we're talking about today. This is the lower part of the Susquehanna. It's absolutely beautiful, where it would have been flooded. It's not deep enough here. I think people in Pennsylvania laugh at us when we say this is the Susquehanna, because the Susquehanna becomes quite a mighty river later on as it flows down into Pennsylvania. But up at the top at Lake Otsego, it is a little more mild. So Clinton had to dam the lake and flood the river, and actually went down the river on the flood. There's Clinton's Dam, the blue marker. If you're not from New York State, if you are, the blue markers are everywhere around here. Many of them were put in the 30s or 1928, as this one was, marking historical events of importance or not importance, as there is one in Schenectady that says an old blacksmith shop stands here. I'm not saying that's not important. I'm just saying maybe something more interesting happened there. So what are we actually talking about today? We've got a little bit of that historic background on what the Sullivan Clinton Campaign is. I am not an expert in it. There are many wonderful books about it. But what I'm going to talk about today, really focusing on, is the celebration of this event. That was quite horrific. This event led to the death of many Haudenosaunee people. It definitely destabilized the region. The goal of the original Sullivan Clinton campaign was to break the Haudenosaunee and to take away their ability to be on the land, and to also make it all the way to Fort Niagara. Those goals were pretty much not attained. We know that Sullivan never made it to Fort Niagara. That was where a lot of the Haudenosaunee ended up wintering in 1779. And afterwards, the Haudenosaunee went home. They went home and they rebuilt on the lands that they lost. And all of a sudden, you have a group of people that really didn't have a reason to be in the fight, and it really gave these people a reason to be in the fight. And you see a lot more and escalated border conflict happening afterwards in 1779, 1780. Really, does it really do much? That remains to be seen, but it was a horrific event. So we are now in 1929. I'm going to go back a little bit more and talk about the 1920s. In the 1920s, people in New York, especially a gentleman who was actually the head of the Mohawk Valley Historical Society, he was an industrialist out of Utica. His name was, oh, forgive me, I don't have it right here and it's escaping me. He was an industrialist. He was interested in the expansion of the automobile and in driving. And he kind of noticed that things were happening in Pennsylvania, planning for the 150th celebrations of the Revolutionary War in Pennsylvania. And he thought, well, why isn't New York doing this? So he gets New York really kind of into celebrating all sorts of different anniversaries in the 20s that had to do with the revolution. They appoint a man named Alexander Flick, who really he's the head of the education department and becomes the head um, of the organizations that are working on these big celebrations. And after about 1927, there's not much left to celebrate, but he still wants to celebrate more. And so Flick sells this narrative of the Sullivan Clinton campaign, and no one really knew much about it at the time. He had to sell it to people. He traveled around New York State saying how great it would be if everyone in all of these towns that had something to do with this destructive campaign, if they would put on their own celebrations. And he gets people excited about this. He says this campaign was important to the expansion of New York State and the expansion of um, all of us heading west, colonists and people after the revolution heading westward. It was super important, is basically what he sells everyone on. Now, people were a little uncomfortable with this, celebrating something that was a war conflict with people who still lived there, who were still community members in a lot of these places or were nearby communities. So it was interesting how he managed to sell this idea of this celebration, but he does a good job of it. And what comes out of it is almost a year-long set of celebrations to culminate in Elmira and a couple of other towns where there were larger conflicts. And he comes up with great pageants that occur in these bigger towns in the fall. Ours is Canajoharie's is the kickoff event, so to speak. We have a proclamation here from Harry V. Bush. He is the mayor of Canajoharie at the time, and he is all in on celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Clinton campaign and the 100th anniversary of the village. So he's got a couple things that are celebrating here, but most of what this focus is and what it really becomes is about the Sullivan Clinton campaign. I do like to note that in this proclamation, I'm sure all of you just read it. Um, where's I do like that businesses should be closed and that private and public buildings decorated for the occasion. So he really wants everyone involved. He wants you there in the seats watching what's going to happen. This is a great little all roads lead to Canajoharie. Wonderful Tudor garb. I'm not really sure what that gentleman is wearing, but this is in celebration of the coming of the sesquicentennial. So a number of pieces of literature come out of these celebrations. This is one of them. It comes with a map, the red lines featuring where the Sullivan Clinton campaign traveled, and a lot of the key players. It has pictures of who was involved. So you can see it's actually quite a big swath of New York, and that was one of the selling points. It was that Flick stated he said, oh, well, Eastern New York has had all of these great celebrations in the 20s. We've left Western New York out. Let's do this. And he really sells people on that idea. And this is a list of the more major observances that they would have in September. The Newton Battlefield near Elmira, Geneva, and the Genesee Castle, the site of the Genesee Castle. So they're getting people excited. They're getting promotional materials out. They, in fact, do a stamp, which you can get on eBay. I looked today for $1.50. I'm going to have to get us a couple of them. So they sell commemorative stamps. They hand out booklets and packets. So it's quite a deal. One of the best pieces from our collection is this. We have a number of them, and it is the Sullivan Clinton sesquicentennial at Canajoharie, quote, the boiling pot. And it's a program. It is also a history booklet. It's kind of a fat little piece of literature, actually, and it has, as shown here, the program for the weekend, but it also has detailed histories of the Sullivan Clinton campaign, who was involved, and I'll show you some of the pictures. These are kind of troubling images, but they are in the beginning of this booklet. These are the pictures that go along with the words about the history of the area and about the conflict. And I'm a picture person. I'm going to look at the pictures in a magazine long before I read the text, and I imagine other people are like that too. So there are more comfortable images like this of the Oriskany Battle Monument. This is from the Green's Turnpike book. They take a lot from other sources to make this. This one is a little more difficult, excuse me for the bad scanning. This is a characteristic scene from the border during the Revolution, according to this publication. And we have Native people inaccurately garbed, being quite menacing, with, I believe, a dead person or two in the front there. Hard to see. Here's two more images. These ones are a little more striking. We have a Native people again burning. This is again a characteristic scene. None of the images in this booklet show settler colonists being in conflict with Native people. It is always the Native people attacking. We know this to be patently false. Often settlers were those that were coming into conflict and beginning conflict with Native people. The Haudenosaunee nations had a firm no killing of women and children or messengers or elders. And that was firm for hundreds of years, long before colonists came to the area. They also had a firm no rape policy, which is something that settler colonials and wartime soldiers did not have on the side of the other side of the conflict. So it's interesting that we're getting from this booklet very, very pointed history that this conflict was necessary, it was important, and it had to happen because of these very threatening, almost devil-like images here that really solidified the danger people faced in the past. Whereas these things aren't true. And that's what's difficult here. And it seems that people knew at the time a lot of this was untrue, but they were still giving this history from a very white settler colonial viewpoint rather than showing the other side of history. One of the first things up on the daily schedule for June 15th and 16th was the parade. It started at 11 a.m. on Saturday, so if you were there in 1929, you sure would have been at the parade. These are some images from the Knickerbocker Press that did a spread on the whole event. The people at the top right are important Canajoharie citizens, according to the notes on the paper. The little captions, excuse me, from the paper say that. And these are people who are dressed, that says they're dressed in the garb of their ancestors. So it's kind of fun to see that. We know that this carriage was part of the parade. We have, again, it noted great citizens of Canajoharie there. Inside the carriage, there is a boy on the back, possibly in blackface. Apologize for that racist image. We have here the regiment, the boys or men making up the regiment. I have, yes. So the text that went with the pictures of the soldiers marching is, um, it says, "More men for Clinton's army. Mohawk Valley Continentals mobilized like this at Canajoharie for their expedition into the wilderness 150 years ago." Here's another image from the parade. What is really been interesting about this project is how we were challenged to get something from our collection, and we really found that we had something. And it was great to work with my director, Sue Friedlander, who's on this call, because of her depth of knowledge of the collection. I kind of had the idea nudging around in my head, because of what we'll go over a little bit later, are some parts of this celebration that still exist today on our landscape. And Sue was very knowledgeable about what we had in the collection, and she found this wonderful but also kind of horrible image, in a book that had nothing to do with, the Sullivan Clinton campaign. It had to do with, the placement of our memorial, garden next to the museum. And this just happened to be the best picture that showed that empty lot of land. I've cut that out of the picture. But the knowledge of the collection, really knowing your collection, became central to this being a successful project. This image is striking. We're pretty sure these are not Native people. When it came to these celebrations, we know that Flick did reach out to Haudenosaunee nations, in Canada, here in New York, and in Wisconsin and Oklahoma, and he received silence in return. Now, silence is a great form of, what would we say, resistance in a way. Surely they did not want to, um, be part of something that was a genocide upon their people. And it's understandable that they didn't want to be a part of this. Haudenosaunee people were sometimes involved in, local celebrations, maybe as dancers, as just part of, community events. But this is one they're notably absent from. So an image like this we can see as people playing Indian, rather than them being Haudenosaunee people themselves. However, are they descendants of some kind? I can't know for sure, but I heartily do not believe they are. Also, the Plains, teepee, um, is definitely inaccurate for our region. One of the things that went along with with these, celebrations that occurred across New York State is that at each one, or at many of them, a monument, was uncovered, was placed and unveiled. This is the monument unveiling, in Canajoharie in June 1929. They lift an American flag from a very tall stone monolith. The monolith has a bronze plaque upon it. It also has one on the back that has, Sullivan and Clinton's faces. We'll see it again later on. We have three people dressed, inaccurately or accurately for the celebration, I suppose. Two people in colonial garb. I enjoyed their high heels, kind of a George Washington figure, and then a person, that looks of wealth, from the time period. Now we have a gentleman who is unveiling the monument. He is in some sort of settler colonial garb with a, um, plains type headdress. This is obviously inaccurate to what people would have been wearing in 1779. Haudenosaunee people, did not wear headdresses like that. So again, we have this playing of Indian, this attempt at making history, but making history definitely from the white settler viewpoint. So really what got us started on this project was these monoliths. The Canajoharie Library and Arkell Museum, are the place of one of these monuments. It still stands today, and it's remarkably close to our front door. And it was something that bothered me when I first came to interview. I kind of wondered, what was that doing there? And what? Why? What is this? And so really that was part of what got us going on this project. This is some more detail from the pageant. These make terrible view, visuals for a presentation, but I left them in because I think it shows in that booklet. This was near the end. You also could get this separate, which was probably much cheaper. And this was what the pageant that came after the parade and the monument dedication. This was the pageant people went to see. And pageantry is something that we may not know much about. It was something I didn't know about until I started working on this. History pageants were all the rage. And that's what's always interesting when you look back at history. It's also what is popular during the time. That really gets into what happens and why they do what they do. So, our people in the past were really into these huge pageants. They come out of England, they're popular, they're retelling history, and they get very popular in the United States. And this, at the time in the late 20s, they're kind of waning. But Flick and his group of celebratory planners really bought into this pageantry, and these pageants follow a formula that is seen in Massachusetts. A scholar did a lot of work on this, how these pageants are set up. They are set up to show that the land was owned by and lived on by Native people, and then they transition to the white settler. Now, that transition is never shown as violent. It is sometimes shown as a wise man or an elder hands off the people, hands to the settlers the place, the land. Ours does not do this, but excuse me, Canajoharie's does not do this, but there's something similar happening. It is still the same structure. After the small beginning portion with Native people living on the land, it transitions to early settlers, how they conquered the wilderness, and these first things that these settlers did. A scholar who studied this in Massachusetts calls it firsting. It's the first white settler. It's the first grist mill. It's the first house. It is the first white baby born. These firstings happen. It's a weird word to say out loud. These firstings happen as if there wasn't a complicated history before. And this really, these large pageants, they are epic in scale. I don't think it's something that we can honestly imagine a community doing today. Sometimes they had pageant directors, the larger ones. I don't think ours did. I'm sure there was someone in charge, but I'm not sure who. Sometimes they're planned artistically by a professional. There were pageant directors who came in to do this. A lot of moving parts in something like this. The larger celebrations in Elmira, the pageant was 4 hours. That's not necessarily true here. I don't think this was 4 hours. At least I hope not. Though they had great weather that day, which is noted many times. Most interesting here is on the left side, episode 1, we have the dawn of creation, and tableau 2 has an Indian chief, and episode 2 has camp life and primitive occupations. And then all of a sudden, boom, scene 2, the early settlers appear. To quote what we see here, the Redskins are plainly in awe of the pale face, but finally accept the fine gifts brought by the white men, and after bargaining with them for their furs, the white men smoke the pipe of peace and pass on to other parts. The chief then starts another dance, and while the braves are each telling their dance story, the squaws and maidens busy themselves breaking camp. Suddenly we transition from this to scene 2, which is Henry Schrembling. Please forgive me, those from Canajoharie, the first settler of Canajoharie in 1723. So that transition is done in a peaceful manner. According to this tableau, it is done without the conflict that we know was there. So they conquer the wilderness, and then in episode 5, we get to the Clinton expedition. We have them arriving and mustering and moving out. And of course, the 4th New York Regiment arrives, and the men are given a warm reception by the other troops. So here's some images from the actual pageant. This is the pageant queen. This is from Knickerbocker Press as well. She was decked out in gold, according to the paper. She was attired in a gown and crown of gold. And this is her actually being led in on a litter by, it looks like uniform folks. These were definitely lots of local clubs were involved with this, local civic organizations. And of course, this coming out of World War I, you would probably have veteran groups as well participating. Here are the Trumpeters. This is actually from the program. They announced the arrival of Miss Columbia, attended by her 48 states. So we have the women of Canajoharie turned out as the 48 states. And then we have Father Time, who actually leads us through the entire pageant. He is quoted as the recorder of all deeds, steadily pressing forward the stark old man, Father Time. So he's kind of the one that pushes us through the entire pageant. And this was a great find we found in the collection of the Canajoharie Library's history archive. A very fun picture. Oops, excuse me, little trigger happy there. So just so you know, it was a success. This big celebration went off without a hitch. According to the Fort Plains Standard and another publication, 25 to 30,000 people were in Canajoharie for this, and that is a lot of folks. I wonder where they all parked. And this was a successful event. They also sold a bunch of those stamps that I mentioned. They sold a lot of them. So they really showed the success of the day. The beautiful weather is noted a number of times, and it's really seen as the successful first parade or first event in this year-long celebratory set of events that is going to occur. So Canajoharie did it. They pulled it off in quite grand fashion. I like in the right-hand article, there's a little note to kind of see who was in the parade. We don't have a ton of pictures from the parade. During the celebration, quote, during the celebration, residents were requested to keep their automobiles locked up, and Canajoharie streets echoed with the unfamiliar clatter of ox carts and the rattle of provision wagons and the click of horses' feet and the war whoop of the Iroquois. The Van Alstyne House, built in 1750, was fittingly decorated, and its front wall appeared a new state marker commemorating here the headquarters of the Revolutionary Committee of Safety and George Washington's visit in 1783. So the whole village is involved. It's a big success. And it has a lot of things that echo into our present, almost nearly 100 years later. And some of those things that echo into the future. This is a well, excuse me, 35, through these celebrations, 35 Sullivan Clinton Campaign monoliths were installed across New York State as part of the multi-year celebration of the 150th anniversary. This is a picture postcard of the old high school that no longer stands in Canajoharie, but to the right you can see the stone monolith is there. This would have been where our great lawn of the Arkell Museum is, so just to orient you to where this would have been. So the monument kind of pops up here and there in our archives. It's kind of strange. We stumbled upon this while doing another exhibition, and I looked at it and I said, oh, look, there's the monument. So we find it here and there, and this was one of those finds. Here is the legacy on the land. Those 35 stone monoliths are really what we have left of this campaign. And I'm sorry if I'm going too long, David. I'm almost done. This is a picture of the entrance to the Arkell Museum and Canajoharie Library. I have not photoshopped this monolith in there. That's literally a nice little turn of the camera and you can get both in the same shot. So it is very public and is very much a part of the entrance it's right off the parking lot. You walk right by it. So having that be a huge part of our basically, welcome to the museum is difficult because it is history that is not contextualized well. What is stated on these bronze plaques are inaccurate information. Some of it's accurate, but it really takes away the nuances and the conflict and really the understanding necessary and really just condenses it into a few short sentences that really don't tell you enough. And there are 35 of them in New York State. That is quite a number of them. Reading up on this, one author noted that there's something about these monuments when you put something in bronze, when you put something in stone like this, you give it heavy weight. You give it, in a way, you give the event, I'm losing the words, you give it solidity, presence. And it seems so important because it has been memorialized in this way. And when you lend that level of importance to something like this without the nuances of what was going on, you really lose the valuable education that we can get from the history. We in a way dumb it down to be not enough, and to have it spread out across our landscape is really unfortunate. Today we see a lot of Confederate monuments coming down, and a lot of us can understand why that would happen. And I wonder what a lot of people are thinking in the historical community about these 35 monoliths. Are we comfortable with this being in front of our buildings, in our town squares, and really being a piece of our history when it is not contextualized very well? So sorry for editorializing. Um, One thing is that these monuments are widespread. If the memorialization of the movement of Clinton across the landscape is still memorialized in other ways today, not just these grand monoliths, it is something you can literally follow. We have a 1911 fountain put up by the DAR, or the DAR, and this went in 1911, long before the 1929 sesquicentennial, and um, so it's already been something people were considering. So this starts us off. We have the monolith, and you can see this in the center of town. There's also a blue sign to Johannes Roof's Tavern, which was important for the Clinton campaign, and then again when George Washington visited. Following that up the hill, you'll head down Clinton Road. You can take Clinton Road, excuse me for not knowing my exact drive down there, but you will be on Clinton Road as you head towards Cooperstown. You'll note blue road signs here and there. This is one that talks about Clinton Road and what happened and how they managed to get that many bateaux and men across the way. You can also go by Clinton Ridge Farm. So the legacy of Clinton on this land is very much here today. You'll find more of these monoliths in Cooperstown and Middlefield, which is the village right across the Susquehanna, or the area across the Susquehanna from Cooperstown. Very similar to our own. This one in Middlefield has been reset, which is important to note. I think it might have been at first looking similar to ours, and has been reset over the years. I meant to take that last picture out. I apologize for it being there. The Middlefield one does recognize the Cherry Valley Massacre, which was an event that led into the was an event that led into the Sullivan Clinton Campaign. So that's pretty much what I have to talk about. Is the fact that these are still part of our landscape and our world, and we need to consider that as history and art people. And I'm opening it up to questions. I couldn't see much of the chat. Excuse me again for that street noise if you heard it. It's kind of just a part of Schenectady. David, is there anything in the chat?
Yeah, and so you might not have seen it. That was by design. I limited some of the chat features so that I could moderate through it, kind of going along with, as you stated early on. If you want to leave this screen up, that's cool. It has your contact information if anybody wants to reach out. First, I want to say thank you, Mary. Thank you to Sue and the board of the Arkell for taking on this project and kind of embracing the opportunity to have difficult conversation around very prominent features within Canajoharie as well as within your collection. So kudos to you and approaching this difficult topic and handling with as much delicacy as it can be.
Well, thank you. I think it's an interesting topic, and it's one that there's a lot of nuance to. So I hope we get more people exploring it.
Yes, and so um, I had a couple of things I was going to kind of ask. There's a few folks that are asking some questions in on the chat, but one of the things that I wanted to note was that you'd mentioned a couple times about the kind of, not assuming that any of us had been at the pageant or the parade or anything. Sometimes it feels that way, though. Sometimes I feel like I am that old. Um, and particularly, I guess I can kind of envision the 1929 parade having been a part of Burning the Valley's reenactment back in 1991, and actually walking or marching in Canajoharie and across the Palatine Bridge as part of the recognition of the Burning of the Valleys in 91. So that seems like ages and ages ago, but I do distinctly remember that myself. So I guess I can extrapolate out a little bit further, at least to have some level of understanding, knowing what a large event that was in the Mohawk Valley back 30 or so years ago now. So I will start off with going through with one of the. Well, I guess we'll go back toward the origins of the beginning of the program. And there's a question from Paul asking, as you had talked about the orders to Clinton from Washington. So Paul asks, if Clinton did not mention casualty figures, what about prisoners? Isn't it seeming that it is one of Washington's main instructions was to capture as many possible? Do you have anything that you've come across in the research where indicating Clinton or somebody else noting how many captives were taken?
Not specifically. I'm sure it's in the readings that I've done, and it's not something I wrote down, so I apologize for that. But I don't think very many people were taken. A lot of these villages were vacant by the time, or had only a few people in them by the time they were come upon by Sullivan soldiers. Not to say that they didn't take captives. I'm sure they did, but that would be something to look up.
Right, right, and as kind of maybe that practice of trying to get out of the way of the tidal wave that is coming, and you had alluded a little bit to particularly the Haudenosaunee, those that had been allied to the Continentals, having a revenge taken upon them. Do you, for those that are tuning in that wouldn't be aware, particularly the Oneidas that were aligned with the Americans, coming back into Canajoharie to enact some revenge. I don't know if there's other information or if that was part of any of this research. Did you come across how that revenge occurred?
Yeah, there's a lot of a lot of what inspired or said to have inspired Washington's actions were the quote unquote massacres in Cherry Valley and Wyoming Valley. Those things did occur and they happened before 1779, but we do know that Washington was looking to move on the Haudenosaunee territories before those things happened. There's evidence that he was soliciting Continental Congress for money before that. It was a good reason to go and make, it was a good reason to tell soldiers and people to get them interested and okay with the work they were doing. But that's again a lot of the history that I've done the work on, but also am not an expert on. So I don't want to, say something that I will regret.
Right, right. And there's a comment and also a question attached here from Paul, saying that it's a good parallel to Confederate monuments of today. And would the Arkell or the library consider adding something like a panel to tell more of the story, adding something perhaps next to this, another monolith or something else?
Yeah, I would love to see that happen. I think that's something that Sue and the board and I will discuss in the next year. Just something that gives us a little more information and makes it hopefully makes visitors a little more comfortable with coming in if they have misgivings about seeing something like that. I think it's just something that we need to do as a museum, but that's something that also needs to be talked over and done correctly. We don't want to do something inappropriately similar, like there's the chance of that. So it's something that needs to be worked out, but definitely something I personally am interested in.
And Sue is also noting that the DAR fountain was placed as the eastern terminus of that campaign. And I would note if that fountain is from 1911, it seems like it's in pretty good shape.
It's a
For
nice
this,
looking, yeah, it's sorry, I don't know how to use my own PowerPoint here. It does look good. I don't know if it was ever redone or it needed to be, but it's quite pretty with the flowers. Eastern Terminus. Um, what does it say? Marks the northeastern terminal of the Continental Road constructed under the supervision of General Clinton to Otsego Lake in June 17th, 1779.
and we do have one through here with a username that isn't quite a name, unless I'm misreading that, but um, kind of a comment with a little bit of a question here. They're stating that they were struck um, throughout the presentation about how memory of the Iroquois peoples and culture appear to have been erased between 1779 and 1929, as evident by the ubiquitous Plains culture. I'm wondering whether, if within your community today, there are visible or prevalent public representation of indigenous peoples and whether they are more historically accurate.
Um, mm, they are not much more historically accurate. There are. It's definitely less than it used to be, I think. We very happily removed a sign of ours. We'll be honest about this. We had a sign that said Canajoharie Library and Art Gallery, and it had a head of an indigenous person with a headdress, and it was very unsettling. And our new librarian came in and she's like, "Can we get rid of the sign?" And all of us were like, "Well, we've all been uncomfortable with it. Yes, like, yes, we can." And I think that that's one thing that all of us were like, "Yeah, of course, we can do this. Oh, we can do this." And I think that realization people are beginning to make about these kind of statues and things like that. So I don't know. There are some culturally uncomfortable things in our region, as many of us know. Um, but yeah, I hope that answers.
And that was a question from Ben, who thankfully had.
Yeah, that is my sorry. That's my history professor from college on
Oh,
the
very good.
revolution.
Very good.
So, hi.
So, and we have a question from Sandy asking, am I correct that General James Clinton, the brother of George Clinton, New York's first governor, was the father of DeWitt Clinton?
Yes, I believe they're all related like that, which is one of the reasons it's kind of funny. This was called the Indian Campaign by Washington. It then became known as the Sullivan Expedition, and then I'm sorry, Indian Expedition, Sullivan Expedition, and then it gets reframed again as the Clinton Sullivan Expedition. So Canajoharie can be involved, and so that Clinton name, which holds so much weight in New York State, can be used again. So they reframe, they rebrand it, and get more people interested by using that name. And yes, it is that relation.
All right. Let's see. There's a comment coming in about the police and fire department with badges with indigenous persons misrepresented, and it's still unfortunate and prevalent as well as inaccurate. And I'm not pointing out Canajoharie in particular. Obviously, we've seen in this last few years this kind of reckoning toward that kind of content across the board in America. And I think the generalization is that Native peoples, indigenous peoples, are just viewed in that very stereotypical white, the great wide open plains type folks, and that goes from sports franchises to other products, and we're seeing that kind of shift and change. Even though it took decades after something like the Pan-Indian movement of the 60s and 70s, and really kind of a lot of the momentum moving forward. Um, but just like
What's
a lot of the, what's that?
Oh, I was going to say some of this momentum I know in Cooperstown when I was living there, they changed from, excuse me for this slur, Redskins as their mascot. Uh, and that was, it had just happened, and then I moved to Cooperstown, and it was something that was begun by the students. And we always look to the young people for these movements, but it's true. It's an understanding that these are old symbols. They don't represent correctly. There are more interesting things that there are more interesting mascots. It's the local baseball team in Binghamton's the Rumble Ponies, like be creative, be interesting. And I think there's a push from the young, as we are not anymore, David, for these changes. And I think that's quite good.
Right. And I have a kind of a question. I'm kind of curious if in the direction of some things at the museum surrounding this kind of project that you're doing, thanks to the work through Manny and the library services, um, that are there plans to host some Haudenosaunee art or artists as part of an exhibit at the Arkell?
We don't have anything right now on the books for that, but the more I've been working, oh man, to go back is not easy. Uh, it's something I've been thinking of in my head, but haven't exactly gotten out. There is amazing work coming out of Ganondagan in Western New York. What they have done, um, their art, regional art. I always forget what those are called. Call for artists. Oh, my brain is gone now. But they're promoting a lot of indigenous art, both visual, um, uh, movies, but also, the more arts and crafts and things like that. Very amazing work coming out of their organization. So it's definitely something I'm interested in. We have an amazing regional art gallery, and I think we maybe could have space for that. But again, that is something that would have to be discussed amongst many people.
And maybe that'll spur some additional conversation because you got about 7 or so years to really plan a new recognition of these events, to have another pageant in Canajoharie for 2029. You've got some time to plan something and to plan it and a greater recognition of a more diverse collective history. Um,
I'll get right on that.
yeah, you'll need every minute of that as well.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little, when working on this, I was like, oh no, may we not do this again in 1929 this way. They did it in 79. I think they actually went overland to Cooperstown. It rained a lot that weekend. Uh, it did not seem as fun. the happiness that came out of the 1929 one was not echoed in 79. So no, I hope we don't do something super similar. I hope we honor and recognize this in a way that presents it in its proper light, in its conflict, in its violence, but also in recognizing that and reckoning with, you know, the past in the region we live in, which is important to do.
Agreed. And Mary, thank you again so very much. Thank you to everyone at the Arkell for taking this project on. And I really appreciate your time this evening in presenting this. Thank you very, very much. And I'll be in touch again soon. Thank you to all those that have tuned in and watched along the way and with the great questions and comments. This has been a fantastic New York State History Month program series, and I'm grateful to all of you that have been a part of that. And well, this is a really thought-provoking and terrific way to end the series. So, Mary, again, thank you very much.
Thank
Greatly
you, David.
appreciate
It
it.
was great. Much appreciated.
All right. Thank you all. Be well. Be safe.